This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you for coming. This is part of a series of seminars that the Center for Integrated Caribbean Studies is having this term. There's a slight change for the next one. It's supposed to be every 2 weeks. And the next one, scheduled for the 6th, 7th of March, is actually going to be moving to the 6th of April. So the next one coming up is going to be March 23rd. It's going to be Peter Solis talking about international aid in Haiti. He used to be with the Interdevelopment Bank. And so he's going to talk about his experience there. He's writing a book on aid in Haiti and how that has affected the country's independence and dependence from the Americas. And the one scheduled for 2 weeks from today that moved to April 6th is Beverly Duguid, who is going to be talking about an epistolary relationship between two women in the 19th century, one in Puerto Rico and one in Cuba. So that's the next one coming up. So tonight we have the pleasure of having Rosemarijn HOFTE from the royal thing always gets me in the Netherlands, KITLV, which is the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. Rosemarijn has a long history of working on the Caribbean in many ways. I'll let you do the introduction because it's changed so much, but essentially she has represented and taught the Caribbean studies in the Netherlands for a long time. Her work has been mainly on the Suriname area, and hopefully the talk today will bring us back into considering the contribution of the Dutch Caribbean to the Caribbean as an entity. So please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and I think this is going to be very informal. And what I would like to do is talk about the Dutch Caribbean and ways how we can integrate the Dutch Caribbean more into Caribbean studies. The Dutch Caribbean has always been seen as separate, and the main reason for that is always, the linguistic barrier. Well, that's too easy, I think. It's more complicated than that. And I have to say that is something I'm really going to talk about today, is how can we overcome previous imperial barriers? Because that is what you see, and it's interesting to me that, for example, people working on the British Caribbean tend to say we're doing Caribbean history and present the British Caribbean as the Caribbean, whereas people from the Spanish, French, and Dutch Caribbean say, well, maybe that's not the whole story. So what I'll do today is I'll briefly introduce the Dutch Caribbean in the region. Then I'll talk about two grand old men whom I think are important to Dutch Caribbean studies. But then I'm going to use one example of current studies as a way of how we can maybe integrate all the areas, all the old imperial studies into one larger geographical framework, which would also mean more interdisciplinarity and more working together with people from other areas. So that is what I'd like to do. Now let me first quickly set the scene. Abolition of slavery in the Dutch Caribbean was rather late, 1863. Only the US and Brazil were later in the region, and Cuba. Then 1948, so we're jumping quickly, is universal suffrage was introduced. That was, of course, outcome of World War II. There was a lot of British and US pressure on the Netherlands to give up the colonies. That was a very painful process in the East, with the Indonesian decolonization wars, still a hot topic in the Netherlands right now, because in the Dutch historiography that's still not called a war. 4 years of heavy fighting is still called police actions. And now actually many stories about mass murders, mass executions are turning up in the Dutch newspapers. Every month there is a new story, and the Dutch are not able to grapple with it, to deal with this. Well, in the Dutch Caribbean that was all rather more civilized, but it was not important to the Dutch. The only thing they cared about was Indonesia. That was the loss of empire. That was where the Indies lost, everything lost. And they didn't care much about the Dutch Caribbean. By that time, it was not of interest, which actually is kind of ironic because the Dutch Caribbean at that point was doing very well. Suriname was having a bauxite industry, was a major bauxite supplier in World War II, and the oil industry in Aruba and Curacao were very prominent as well. So it's a bit disingenuous. 54, they became all the colonies became autonomous, which means that they were autonomous except for defense and foreign affairs. So this is basically in line with the rest of the Caribbean. And then in 75, Suriname became independent, basically because they wanted to become independent, and the Netherlands were more than ready to say, oh, please go. They also tried to have the Dutch Antilles, the 6 islands, to become independent, and they never did. This was a game of smoke and mirrors. It still is a game of smoke and mirrors, and the Antillians win it all the time. The Dutch are not very good at playing this game. And in 2010, we see a constitutional restructuring of the former Antilles, and it's an easy day to remember. It's 10-10-10, 10 October. And since that time, the Kingdom of the Netherlands has 4 countries. It's the Netherlands, Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten. So these 4 countries, some of them extremely small, as you'll see, are autonomous countries in the kingdom. The other 3 islands that are Bonaire, Sint Eustatius, or Statia, and Saba are extraordinary cities of the Netherlands, or municipalities. So they are part of the Netherlands. In the Caribbean, they are the same as, say, Amsterdam or Leiden, except maybe they're not the same. This is a very controversial move. It has been a very controversial move. It was a referendum. Every island had a vote whether they wanted to become independent, whether they wanted to become autonomous country, whether they wanted to become part of the Netherlands. The 3 smaller ones voted to become part of the Netherlands, also thinking probably that it would be a kind of a French construction, that they would have immediate influence in the Netherlands, that they could elect parliamentarians, that Dutch social security laws would apply in the Caribbean. Well, what happened was that some Dutch laws did apply, and that were exactly the laws they didn't want, like euthanasia, abortion, gay marriage. That are things that are controversial in the Caribbean anyway, but that were the laws that were implemented, but the laws that they wanted, as social security, old age pensions, healthcare, were not implemented. So now you hear a lot of grumbling in these 3 islands saying, this is actually not what we wanted, we are very unhappy with the situation. So there is a very mixed bag of, these are all small countries, and it's a very mixed bag of how they feel about the Netherlands. By and large, the feelings in the Antilles are negative, and the feelings in Suriname, that is independent, is the most positive. And the ties, also the cultural ties with the Netherlands, are strongest in Suriname. So this is not what you would expect. But actually the ties between Suriname and the Netherlands have strengthened after independence. And also to the surprise of the census takers in 2012, it turns out that more than 60% of the households in Suriname speak Dutch as the first language. More than 60% say they speak Dutch as a first language. So that is a really surprising development. And Suriname becomes more and more integrated in the Dutch area cultural studies. So if you had told me that 20 years ago, I would never have believed it. So that this is something that tells you that independence or constitutional ties are not telling the story about cultural ties, about education. So I think that is an important thing to keep in mind. By the way, if you have any factual questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me. The discussion can come later, but. Now I want also to talk about intellectual infrastructure because I really think that is important when we talk about Caribbean studies. This is a bit tricky because I give these dates like 1983 for the University of Suriname, but actually we should talk about the 1960s, 1970s, and there has been a medical school since '82. But what is important, I think, is to see what is happening at these universities. Suriname is the most complete university when we talk about it, with history and sociology. The one that is lacking is anthropology, which is a shame in Suriname, given the population, given its history. This is really a shame. And I was in a project doing oral history among Surinamese Javanese population in Suriname, in Indonesia and in the Netherlands. We were looking for anthropologists to do oral history interviews. We easily could find them in Indonesia, we could easily find them in the Netherlands, we couldn't find anybody in Suriname. So this is something that is really, I think, is a problem. But what you see at the universities in the Netherlands Antilles, I still call them Netherlands Antilles, because that is the easiest to do. You see it's all law and business. It's very much geared to what people can use on the islands. But it is not a general education. And you'll see that most people will go either to the US or to the Netherlands if they want to do an MA, even if they want to do a BA. But especially MA, PhDs are usually done elsewhere. And then, of course, the big question is, do people go back? Problem that occurs all over the Caribbean, but this is very much a problem in the Dutch Caribbean. And one of the more famous studies on Saba was called Educated to Migrate. So people, once they get their education, they leave. There is almost no funding for research on the islands, so it's very hard for people to actually do research. And it's actually only the University of Suriname which has ties with universities in the neighborhood, especially University of the West Indies and Trinidad. The history department, for example, is very good at getting people in, flying them in, having them teach seminars. But they have, for example, had only one PhD in Suriname yet. So this is very fledgling, this is all very new, and most people who are at the university, are teaching or are in administration and don't have time to do research. And they don't have research time, so it actually has to come from outside. And I think that is I'll talk about funding later, but this is a real problem in these areas, to have them catch up with the rest of the Caribbean. Now I want to move to two giants, quote unquote, in Dutch Caribbean history, but they're very important to the development of Caribbean studies. And the first one is a Surinamese called Rudy van Lier, who is a sociologist. He was born in Paramaribo and moved to Leiden in 1929, and he became a student of Johan Huizinga, the famous Dutch historian. And he really contributed to Suriname studies, but also to Caribbean studies, even though that's not well known. He transplanted Furnival's thesis of the plural society. Does everybody know what the plural society thesis is? So that was based on Malaysia, on Furnival's experiences in Malaysia, and he transferred that to the Caribbean. Before M.G. Smith, before all the other people talking about, he was the one who introduced it. And his book, Frontier Society, is still a classic on Surinamese history, even though the emphasis on ethnicity is questioned, not only by Marxists who want to talk about class, but also because it really is overwhelming on ethnicity. But interestingly enough, he became a professor of sociology as a Surinamese already in the late 1940s, so immediately after the war. So there was this, so he has been very influential and has a lot of students who, and he is also, by the way, a famous poet and a novelist. Then the other one is Harry Hoeting, who was a high school teacher. He's a Dutchman, but was a high school teacher in Curaçao. And there he wrote his dissertation, het patroon van de oude Curaçaose samenleving, the pattern of the old Curaçaoan society. And that really was the basis for his famous book, the Caribbean Race Relations book. And he was the one who came up with the term and using the term somatic norm image. And he's emphasized that somatic modalities are closely linked to the norms and ideals of a physical type of the dominant group. So the way the dominant groups, the way that group looks, that is going to be the ideal for society. So the norm image of the elites sets the standard for the whole society. And he says, well, actually all Caribbean societies are segmented societies, so that means that the white somatic type is going to be dominant and going to be seen as ideal. So this is a very important book. It's still been quoted a lot. And he has written other books on the Dominican history, on the Dominican Republic, Dominican history. So he is one of those people who has moved out of that Dutch Caribbean orbit, is very comparative, does history, sociology, very well read, and this is, I think, he is an example of how we should be doing Caribbean studies. And by the way, I have Hoeting's copy of Van Lier's Frontier Society. So the two guys come together in my bookcase. Now the example that I would like to use to look at how we can do more comparative, integrated studies is, I borrow it from the Atlantic studies. That is, of course, not a new phenomenon. That's been going on for 30, 40 years now. But it is new to the Dutch. And as the German poet Heinrich Heine once said, if the world comes to an end, go to the Netherlands. Everything happens there 50 years later. And this is true for Atlantic studies as well. The reason for that is, I think, that the Dutch were kind of reluctant in this whole Atlantic area studies. was because it was seen as not that important to the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic that blossomed, the cultural blossoming, economic blossoming, that was always thought of as something that had to do with Asia and with trade, European trade, but not so much with the Atlantic. Now it's becoming clear that probably the Atlantic was much more important than previously thought. Even though it didn't live up to the high expectations. Expectations in the beginning were enormous of what this could be. That never happened, but it was more important than we thought. And Leiden historian Pieter Emmer, who incidentally dedicated his entire career to Dutch Atlantic history, concluded that the Dutch were not very important in that part of the world. After 60 years of studying, that is a sad conclusion, I think. But now we're coming to the point that this might not be true. And we see a lot of interesting studies, and I'm not going to mention names here and books, but it is remarkable that the most productive studies, scholars here, are in the US. Some of them are with Dutch backgrounds, but most of this is coming from the US. Now, what is the Dutch Atlantic? Obviously, that is not a uniform definition. Nobody really agrees on what it really is, and it depends also when you look at it. But the focus is usually at period 1680-1800, and this is not this is not the time of the largest Dutch expanse at that time. At that time, Brazil is already lost, northeastern Brazil, and the New Netherlands, or New York, is also gone. So that is not, in this setting, it's not part of the Dutch Atlantic. What is also usually not included is the Cape Colony, also part of the Atlantic, obviously. But given that the Cape Colony by that time was already very mixed, a lot of English, British intrusion already, that is not included. So what you have is actually what we're talking about now, is the Dutch Caribbean islands, the Guyanas, and I'm saying the Guyanas because that includes part of British Guyana, Demerara, Berbice. So the Wild Coast, bless you, and the trading post of Elmina in Western Africa. This is, of course, crucial to the slave trade. And what is important to realize with the Dutch is that they are very much geared towards commerce. It is very much geared towards trading, and it's very limited as far as intellectual, political, cultural presence. And also at this time already, you see that Dutch naval power is dwindling as well. So this is important for the rest of the story. So this is already contracted to a really small area in which the Dutch don't have all that much influence. It's still theirs, but how Dutch is it? And that, I think, gives us opportunities to study the area much easier. It is a very open empire. They have people coming in and out. There is very little Dutch control. And connections are really weak. That is remarkable. Between the Guyanas and the islands, there's almost no connection, but there are very strong links with the other empires. If you think about, for example, Curacao, very strong links with Puerto Rico. So there are very strong links between Curacao and the Spanish Main, what is currently Venezuela. So here are, I think, our opportunities to work on an integrated approach. And then the Guyanas have very strong links with North America. Most of the trade of Suriname and what is now British Guyana, or is now Guyana, is with North America. It's not with Europe. So I think this opens up areas for research. A second interesting and third interesting point is that the Dutch were not very good at installing their authority. That also has to do with the Dutch themselves. The Republic was not a very clear authoritarian structure. These 7 provinces never gave each other much room, and there was a perpetual contestation of authority. What you also see is which is also different, I think, from most of the Caribbean. We see differences in slave imports, that is not so surprising, that you have plantations and plantation labor, for example, in the Guyanas, which you don't have much on the islands. If there is slavery there, it's often domestic or urban slavery or maritime slavery. It's a different type of slavery. But even more interesting is that the Europeans who came to these islands, to these colonies, were mostly non-Dutch. It was a very mixed group. And contemporary observers said, well, it's the Germans pulling the strings. English are pulling the strings. English is spoken everywhere. In both Curaçao and Suriname, a large Jewish community. So here this is already a very international community where the Dutch influence is very limited, again giving us opportunities to do research. There is a great linguistic and religious variety. I want to add immediately that the Dutch tolerance myth, of course, is a myth, that they tolerated everything. That is not true, but it is true that there is a variety. For example, Curaçao, the elite is Dutch Reformed, as you would expect, but the population is Catholic, and they import priests from the Spanish Main to service this Catholic population. The free-collareds, the former slaves, they're all Catholic. So this is an interesting twist again, which opens up a lot of opportunities for research. And then I also, the last question, what does this say about loyalty to the Republic? And that is very questionable, whether there was a lot of loyalty or strong loyalty towards the Republic. An interesting thing about this is that that is exactly the question that the Dutch government is dealing with the Antilles now. How strong is the loyalty to The Hague? How strong is the loyalty to the Dutch monarchy? Well, no, it's very strong towards the Dutch monarchy. But how strong is it to the Dutch state? And so it's interesting that questions from that question in 1700 is coming back in the year 2015. Again, who are these people, and who do they think they belong to? So but it also tells you something about that they don't feel as part of a Dutch empire. I already mentioned the difference in slave regimes, and it's exactly these two things, slavery and maroon communities, that have attracted most research attention. In history, but also in archaeology, in anthropology, high-level studies, also partly by Americans. Again, but this is what characterizes Dutch Caribbean studies up to now. It's plantation slavery and it's marronage. And then especially the maroon communities in Suriname, which is of course a fascinating subject. And we see more and more interest now in maritime marronage, which again gives us very good clues to do comparative and interdisciplinary research. Because you see it from the islands to the Spanish Main, but I just saw a paper on marronage from the Dutch Caribbean islands to Puerto Rico. There is to Cuba. So here are things that open up possibilities for research and make it much larger and across empirical borders. So why am I stressing this? Because I think what is really important here is these trans-imperial connections. That's what I'm trying to impress. This is not a Dutch thing. This goes across. And it goes to the English Caribbean, it goes to Spanish-speaking Caribbean, it goes to French-speaking Caribbean. It is really interesting. And I think we really have to get out of this individual territory and look at the larger connections. This offers us so many challenges and interesting ideas, I think. Larger comparative and interdisciplinary framework. And this is nothing new in Atlantic history, of course. This is what a lot of people in Atlantic history have been doing now for decades. But I think it's time to do that in the Caribbean as well, and include the Dutch Caribbean in that. So, I call for a new geographic framework, basically. And that will give us new insights. It will give us a fresh look at things we thought we knew. And it might also give us a look at connections that we had never considered before. And we're only at the beginning. And I also think we should move away from this European perspective of divvying up artificially these empires, because people in the Caribbean didn't act according to those borders. And an interesting example, I said I was not going to mention names, and of course I will make one exception now, is a very recent article by Alison Gaines. She is an American historian.
James?
Gaines.
Gaines.
It's published in the William and Mary Quarterly of last year. And she is an Atlantic historian, did her first work on British migration to Barbados. And she has written an article called Cohabitation Suriname Style, English Inhabitants in Dutch Suriname after 1667. That is when the Dutch traded New York for Suriname. And she says, well, what is interesting is, yes?
Could you repeat the title?
Cohabitation Suriname Style, English Inhabitants in Dutch Suriname after 1667. And if you have JSTOR or any, it's easily accessible. But what she says is, and this is true, she says this history of early Suriname is falling through multiple historiographical cracks. To the English, it was less interesting than Barbados or Jamaica, because that is where they had their plantations and were interested. And to the Dutch, this was the time of Suriname that was messy. They hadn't really established authority, so they never had an interest either. And here she is, she learned to read Dutch, is reading the Dutch documents, comparing it to the English documents, and is writing this fascinating history of people trying to deal with different authorities, setting up their own lives. Some of them left, went to Jamaica to set up Suriname in Jamaica, but so there is a very interesting way of, and this is again, you start small, but you combine the two, and this is, I think, where we should be headed. Now, I don't know, in here, are you very much into SWOT analysis? That is a big thing in the Netherlands. It's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Here they come. Okay, the strength in Dutch Caribbean history is slavery and Maronet. That's obvious. That is where, my guess, like this, 60-70% of the publications are on this topic. We see that it's actually now becoming more sophisticated, more interested in, for example, urban slavery, more interested in maritime slavery. It's getting there, but it still needs to catch up compared to the rest of the Caribbean. It also has to do with the availability of sources. A weakness is the comparative studies and interdisciplinary studies. And I'm thinking of things like what we could do, which is transnational. Migration studies is obvious. Ecological history is a big thing that should be done, is not done. Yeah, I'm looking at you too. But you see, there is a lot there that goes across borders. That's transnational. It's not done. So I'm calling, and that is the opportunity for a new perspective. Transnational, trans-empire, and don't fix on a single location, or if you fix on a single location, then look at how things merge, like Alison Games has done. So we're not only breaking down all barriers, but also modes of analysis, and cut across hierarchies and borders. Be open and move beyond those parochial frameworks that we have been using. And the threat is funding. And I'm now looking at the Dutch situation, because funding in the Dutch Caribbean is very limited or non-existent. But the problem in the Netherlands is twofold. On the one hand, in general, there is less money for humanities and social sciences. That is not surprising. The problem is that the money that is available is very much geared towards the Netherlands, towards Dutch interest and what that does to society, which means that area studies are really having a hard time. But ironically, and that's really ironic, there is a lot of money right now, and I'm talking about like 10 million euros for the Dutch Caribbean islands. That was part of the 10-10-10 package. And the first call was 3 years ago, that they thought, that the Dutch government thought that given that these 3 islands became extraordinary municipalities of the Netherlands, they should also be integrated in the research structure. Now, to go back, you remember how many people were living in Statia, Bonaire, and so altogether maybe 25,000 people. So there were 10 million spent on that. And so what happened, first of all, was that poor Statia is flooded by researchers. Some people say there are more researchers than people. But second, and that was really when it was announced, and it was in a room full of people, and people were really gasping when they heard it, the Dutch Caribbean universities were not included. They could not apply and they could not participate. So everything came from the Dutch. Very empirical, very top-down. And there is a lot of resentment, as to be expected, from the universities of Aruba, Curaçao, St. Maarten, saying this cannot be true. Tomorrow is the second call. They have a new meeting, and because of all the protests, it's now been decided that you have to include a partner from the Dutch Caribbean. So at least that part is settled. It's not that the Dutch Caribbean can lead the call, they have to be included, but at least we're getting somewhere, instead of this top-down and all these Dutch people invading the island. But my problem is, here is 10 million euros, which is a lot of money, on 3 islands. Focusing on 3 islands. So it is exactly doing what I think we should not be doing. And that is, now we are again comparing Statia to St. Maarten. Instead of, what is the link between Statia and Puerto Rico? Or whatever. So instead of broadening our focus, we're actually narrowing it and throwing in a lot of money to narrow the focus. So I'm very frustrated with this whole thing, obviously. And then the other thing that I'm worried about is education in the Suriname and in the Antilles. Education, by and large, is poor, quality of it. And universities are really fixed basically on business, on law, on tourism, except for Suriname. And there, anthropology is, for example, lacking. History is small. Dutch language studies is minor. And they're basically, actually, it's more like what you call it, I don't know what you call it here, but in the US you would call it community college. So it's a different level, but it's more to teach people to become teachers, for example. So it's more teacher training colleges than researchers. So I think here that is a threat to the whole region. It's not like, not as strong, not as integrated as, for example, the University of the West Indies or the Université Antiguenne, which are much stronger and have much stronger connections to each other. Because here these universities are not connected to each other. They're all literally on their own island. So this is my plea for more integrated transnational Caribbean studies to make it more viable. Also to the rest of area studies, because the Caribbean, after all, is a very small area. So I'm